Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Getting Creative with the Request Framework to Solve Your Unique Business Challenges. My name is Ashwin Kumar, and I'm part of the product team here at Workday. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We recognize that these are unusually difficult and uncertain times, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us. We hope that you find today's webinar informative. Today's discussion is part of the Looking Forward with Workday webinar series, which was designed to highlight how Workday can support your organization as you respond to the changing needs of your employees during this challenging time. Before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a gray bar with multiple widgets. All of the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. I'll cover each one from left to right. So on the very left of the gray bar is the Help widget, where you'll find resources and information for common technical issues should you experience any while viewing the webinar. Next, to the right of that, you should see a Slides widget, which should already be open, and you can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. Audio comes through the Media Player widget, and therefore it's not one that you can close or minimize in the application. Since we do have quite a few attendees today, attendees are muted. But we definitely encourage you to use the Q&A widget, which is the speech bubble with the question mark there in the middle of the gray bar. We encourage you to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll try to answer these at the end of today's session. But if a fuller answer is needed, or if we run out of time, those questions will be answered later via email. Please know that we do capture all questions, and today's webinar will be recorded and made available in approximately 24 hours after the presentation. And this recording can be accessed using the exact same link that you used to join today's session. Next up on that bar, we have a resources list. It should be open currently to the upper right. You can find additional materials related to the request framework, which is the feature area that we'll be covering today. And we've also included a link to register for upcoming dates of the Looking Forward with Workday webinar series. And lastly, there's one extra icon all the way to the right of the widget bar at the bottom of your screen, and it should be a speech bubble with lines. That's to complete a brief 3-question survey at the end of the webinar that will help us bring you topics that you want to hear more about and improve our future webinars. We really encourage you to take a minute towards the end of the session today to provide feedback. And for the last housekeeping item, I want to call out that our safe harbor statement does apply to any forward-looking statements made in this presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce the rest of today's speakers. In case you missed it at the beginning, I'm Ashwin Kumar from the product team at Workday. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And presenting today with me, we have Deb Verbooks, an IT analyst from Williams. We have Lorena Mont, a financial systems analyst from Florida Atlantic University. And we have Martha Castro, a business systems analyst implementing Workday here at Workday. So for today's agenda, I'll start us off with a brief introduction to the request framework. Then I'll pass it off to Deb from Williams to explain how Williams uses the request framework for their change management processes. Then Lorena from Florida Atlantic University will explain their process of requesting to cancel checks and how the request framework has overhauled that process. And lastly, Martha from Workday will talk about how Workday has implemented the request framework for a timely and unique use case for requesting essential employee status during the COVID-19 guidelines. And lastly, if time permits, we'll try to answer a few of the questions that have come in during the call. And of course, the rest of those questions that we're not able to answer, we'll follow up with through email. So jumping into the presentation, what is the request framework? It's at a high level, it's a simple process that Workday has that is configured by administrators to help employees request, track, and then help request and track changes within Workday. And then it helps administrators report and audit on those same changes. Some of the key benefits of the request framework are that it's very customizable. So unlike other pre-configured business processes in Workday, where the data you're trying to collect is fairly set in stone, with the request framework, you can create your own custom e-form layout and collect the data that you want from your end users. And so in that way, it's very configurable, very customizable, especially for these type of self-service requests, where you'd like your employees to provide some sort of information to administrators downstream. Another key value of the request framework is the time to value, the quick turnaround from coming up with the concept of what you'd like to implement and the data that you like to collect and how you'd like to track it, to the deployment of actually implementing that workflow in the Workday tenant. And lastly, is the last key thing I'd call out for the request framework is the auditability it provides. So these requests that were previously made in external systems or that didn't have much visibility before are now able to be all in one system, from the end user's perspective to the administrator's perspective to even the auditor coming in and looking at why changes were made or why requests were, what requests were made by employees. So before the request framework, here's an example of like what a self-service request might look like. An end user would submit a request, maybe through email or maybe by submitting a paper, pushing a paper onto an administrator's desk, asking for some sort of request. Maybe it was a request to add something to their Workday tenant, maybe giving them access to a report, something along those lines. The administrator would then either approve or deny, and this could be through like a signature on the paper or an email reply. And from there, they let the right person know, the right Workday configurator know to implement that change within Workday and make sure that the change is deployed correctly. And that's the part that actually happens within Workday. And then maybe they'll send, they'll alert the approver will alert the end user, and the process will be complete. And that again happens outside of Workday. So a couple issues with that was that we lose the auditability of why people made the changes that they made within the Workday tenant, right? How do we know that it came from a request? Also, we lose visibility. How can we track when the request originally started, whether the approvals were made to it, and what the change actually was because of that request? And lastly, I'd say that a big problem was the multiple systems that organizations would have to use to navigate this one workflow. After the request framework, we brought that, or with the request framework rather, we brought that all into Workday. So from the initial self-service request to the approval, to the workflow, routing the request to the approver, to the implementation of the change, verification of the change, and finally completing it, reporting on it, and auditing that change. It's all within one system within Workday. So you get that auditability, you get the visibility, and of course you get the Workday power of one, bringing it all into one system. And with that, I will pass it off to Deb to highlight how Williams uses the request framework for change management.
Thanks, Ashwin. So my name's Debbie Brooks, and I work at Williams, and we're in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Williams is an energy company, and our core business is natural gas processing and natural gas pipelines within the U.S. So my business case use case is using request framework for change management. At Williams, we use the request framework to track all Workday production changes, and these include activation of roles that allow production modifications, so those are for both implementers and privileged user accounts, Workday security changes, and Workday production changes. We track approvals using the request framework, and our requests require multiple approvals for each request. So we allow the requester or an approver to add an attachment, such as a change instruction or a testing result, throughout the process. And we use condition rules for approval routing. So this simplified our audit process, Prior to implementing this, it was a challenge to produce reports for our auditors that matched the change request to the change in Workday. So before Request Framework, our request and approval was in an external system. So all the approvals would occur in the external system, and then once it was approved, we would implement the change within Workday. To reconcile the change and verify, the data had to be extracted from the external system and extracted from Workday, and then we merged it using Excel reports and VLOOKUPs into a consolidated spreadsheet. So that also required some manual effort. So our change management was an external system. Reports were generated in multiple systems and merged using Excel. And reporting was very time-consuming and couldn't be executed on demand. So after the request framework, our full process end-to-end is completed in Workday. Our process, the requester submits a request with a questionnaire, and then the request is sent to multiple approvers. And in this example, there's a routing decision, which is after the question, that is based on the questionnaire answer. So at any point in the approval chain, the request can also be sent back to the requester for more information. And then after all the approvals are complete, the change is implemented and verified within Workday. So how did we resolve this? First, we created questionnaires for each type of change request. And then we have workflows that route the request based on questionnaire type, questionnaire answers, and requester role. We also allow an approver to send back a request for additional details. And when this occurs, we want to skip any previous approvers when the routing resumes. We also allow an approver to forward the request to an additional approver. So for an example, an HCM approver may want to forward to the payroll approver if the request affects payroll also. And then the last is we've created closed resolutions for each request type for robust reporting. So here's an example of our questionnaire, and our questionnaire has some open text boxes in it, but the key piece of this are there's radio buttons in the center, and I realize this is a little hard to read, but my example here has recruiting on it. So we're selecting for recruiting, and that is how it's used to route. And then the second piece are the condition rules. So my business process has it's still hard to read. The first piece of it is who's the security approver and have they approved, and then it goes to the employee's manager. And then the third piece is conditional. So the condition I've expanded in the box below, and the condition's based on what kind of request is it? So for this example, it's a security request. What was the answers in the functional area? So this is for recruiting. And then the last piece of it is, has this approver already approved? And this is added to skip the approver when the request was sent back for additional information. And then a key piece that we did is we added closed resolutions. So this is an example of a closed resolutions for our security change, which is by far our largest one. And we used this so we could track the change that occurred and what was closed on the request to what the change that occurred within Workday. So it allowed us to link them together. The last step was reporting, and we created a single report to encompass all of our requirements. So the report needed to include details about who requested the change and who approved the request. We also needed to determine when was the change completed in production and who completed the change. To track approvals, we created calc fields to include who the request is waiting on and if it is approved and ready to complete in production. And then the last part, we added parameters to run the report by a date range, a requester, or a functional area. So this is a sample of our custom report, which is much larger than I could include in one screen capture. And there's a few items I wanted to go through. The first is that we created a unique request number by using a date timestamp as a number, and that's in the first blue box. And this was a key piece of the solution, as it allowed us to link the request to a security change. So we then take this number and include this request number when we activate a security change. So that helped to reconcile the actual change to the request. Our report also includes all of the fields on the request, all of the approvers and when the approval was completed, who completed the request and the resolution that was selected. So for my example that I've been showing with recruiting, that's in the second box that shows that I created a security group, who the request is waiting action. That's the third box there. So this allows us to use who is it waiting on and is it ready for production? And then we allow all the attachments that are created every step to be included in this report. So in conclusion, this process successfully filled all of our requirements. We have a single report to review all changes in production, which include access requests, security changes, production changes, such as configuration, business processes, integrations, and reports. And we can track the request end-to-end, including all of the approvals. And then we simplified our audit process because it enabled us to reconcile an approved change request to the actual Workday change. So I'd like to thank everyone at Williams for your support. I know there are a lot of you on this call today, and also thank Workday for the opportunity to present my use case. And with that, I'm turning back to Ashwin.
Thanks, Deb. I will pass it over to Lorena from Florida Atlantic University to talk through how Florida Atlantic implemented Request Framework to streamline their cancel check process.
Yes, thank you, Ashwin, so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Lorena. I work at FAU, Florida Atlantic University. We're located in Boca Raton, Florida, South Florida. We're a state university, one of 12, with over 30,000 students and over 3,000 employees, almost 4,000. So I will be going over how we use the request framework to streamline our cancel check process. So business use cases, what we wanted to do, first of all, is track and fulfill employee requests to cancel checks. So we wanted to automate. We wanted to automate a labor-intensive, inefficient, paper-based business process. We also wanted to have one system for 3 different departments. So we have financial aid, we have cash management, we also have payroll, and we have accounts payable. We also wanted to get rid of the paper, no more paper. So we created a seamless flow of transit and storage of documents using the request framework. So before the request framework, our process included the requester who would print and complete the form, and then the requester would interoffice or email the forms to cash management. Cash management, our department, would print, scan, and also process the cancellation of the check or the stop payment in an external system called CashPro by Bank of America. And so they would then gather all paper forms. They would gather the confirmation. They would gather an email that they would send the requester that it has been fulfilled, and also the initial request form. They would hand that over to the associate controller for review and approval. Then the associate controller would hand once they review and approve, they would hand over all the forms back to cash management, who would then scan and store on a network drive. And of course, this means that the payment has been issued, the stop payment has been issued, and the check has been canceled. So as you can see, it's a very laborious and very manual process, and an overwhelming amount of paperwork, storage, manpower for the storage. So after we went on the request framework for our process, this is how it flowed. The requester would submit the questionnaire, so they would kick off the request framework process, and then fill out the questionnaire. It would go to the cash manager, or it goes to the cash manager for approval. The cash manager approves, and then they also fill out a questionnaire, which they would let them know if the bank has confirmed if the cancellation of the check has been processed or the payment has been stopped, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have a condition rule that if it's a Title IX return of funds, it would then go to the financial aid department for approval, and then they would also upload documents. But if that's not the case, then it goes back to the requester. The requester would upload a confirmation of the cancellation in Workday, that the payment has been canceled. Then after that, it goes back to the cash manager for approval, and the process is complete, all within Workday. So as you can see, we met our goal of automating everything from start to finish, and we got rid of the paper. So as I said before, everything is powered by Workday. It starts off with the request framework, of course, with the questionnaire, automated routing for approval, no need to hand over any more paperwork, spend time in transit. We also have attachments within the process via the questionnaire. So cash management, payroll, financial aid, accounts payable, all those documents are attached and stored in Workday. And then, of course, we create a custom report to track all of the requests to cancel the check or stop payment. So the initiator would start off with the questionnaire, fill this out. This is just a snapshot. There's more questions. But here's an example of a document that they can upload and attach. So this is a document of a student who has said that their payment, they received a check in error, so they are handing it back in. So that's one example. So that's the first step. Then this is the example of how the questionnaire looks like for the cash manager. So they would indicate the action taken with the bank, if the check has been canceled, if the payment has been stopped, if the cancel has been canceled, or if the stop payment has been canceled. So they have several options. And then here we can see that they can attach a confirmation from Bank of America, from the bank, that the cancel was, the payment has been stopped. So now we see how we have configured questionnaires in our request framework process. And the very neat thing about this is that we can use the answers from the questionnaires to determine the routing of the process. So here, for example, if the cash manager at step C responds that the check has already been cashed, which is the example I have here in my condition rule, then it skips the whole process and goes straight to close because, of course, there's nothing to cancel because it's already been cashed. And at close step, these are some examples of what the cash manager would upload or attach in the system. So here's a copy of the check of someone. Let's see. No, it's a different example, but yes, a copy from a student's check, and then also the confirmation from the bank that the issue was canceled. The cancel was, yes, it's been canceled. So here's our example of our report that tracks all of the requests for the cancellations of checks. As you can see, we have all types of information on this report: status updates, resolution status, completion date, the attachments, of course, So here you can see a visual of how the attachments look like in a report. So the benefit for FAU of using the request framework is that we've saved a lot of costs because we've eliminated the resources to scan and use the filing cabinets and, of course, fees that are associated with storage. We've also reduced the use of paper and printing costs and, of course, the mailroom envelopes for interoffice and delivery services. And we've also have a speedier process. So we've eliminated the time to handwrite paper forms, time in transit to interoffice everything, time in scanning, manual review, approval, and storage. Everything can be done in the same day. And for FAU, Florida Atlantic University, organization impact overall of the request framework is that it has eliminated inefficient, cumbersome, paper-based processes. The cancel check is just one of them. It's also improved the ability for us to respond to our state auditors' requests. So, for instance, we're able to provide the approval path and also why someone at our company approved, what role or capacity they held that granted them that approval. We've also improved tracking and reporting on all business forms and approvals, and we've made it possible for quicker decision-making and status updates on critical forms and processes. And with that, that is all we have for Florida Atlantic University. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Back to you, Ashwin.
Thank you, Lorena. I will now pass it off to Martha to introduce how Workday has quickly released a request type to address new needs that have arisen during the COVID-19 guidelines. So Martha, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Ashwin. Hi, everyone. My name is Martha Castro. I am on the Workday on Workday team. We are the customer arm of Workday. So this is the team that implements Workday for Workday. And as Ashwin said, I'm going to be covering the essential employee status request that we created. So our business use case had three main components, or three things we were trying to solve for. We needed the ability, once the COVID pandemic was in full swing and we started to close some of our offices globally, we needed some workers to still maintain access to those closed offices. And so we needed the ability to identify who those workers are. We also wanted to track approvals to make sure that workmates who were accessing the buildings had leadership support for the activities that they were completing while they were there. And then also in some locations, we needed to provide workmates with a certification or a letter from Workday saying that they did have essential worker status and that it was okay for them to enter the building. And this use case for us was kind of the first of several use cases that we've implemented to support the COVID-19 response. This does extend beyond just the request framework for us, but the request framework is very much at the core of the solution, as you'll see in the following slides. So for us, before our use case came about, we were all focused on the next vacation and soaking up the sunshine. We had not contemplated the need in Workday to identify workers as providing critical business functions or having any kind of essential employee status, or the idea of needing to maintain access in closed locations. But as we moved into further into the pandemic and more offices were closing, we looked to the request framework to help us streamline the process. So the request is initiated by an employee. We do have a questionnaire built into it, asking what what they need access to the building for, what business functions they're going to be performing while there. There are some approval steps, a couple of conditional approvals in there as well, routing to our legal team if the requester is in a country that hasn't already previously been approved for essential status, so that our legal team can review any local restrictions. They can develop that certification, that letter that I mentioned, and then also a conditional step coming back to the Workday on Workday team so that we can configure that letter. The highlight in our solution is the integration that's included, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides as well. So a colleague of mine described our COVID response as being a tapestry of Workday features, and I really like that description because in this case in particular, Request Framework is one of kind of three key features that we are blending together to provide a seamless solution. So one of the features is the use of custom organizations. So this is really how we are identifying those essential workers as having that essential worker status. This is helping us with facilitating easy reporting on that population. It's helping us maintain access to the buildings. So our security team is using that to identify who needs to keep active badges and that sort of thing. And then that custom organization is also helping us drive access to the reference letters that I mentioned. The request framework is helping us kind of navigate the process of submitting the request, collecting the approvals, documenting the reference letters that need to be generated. And then, of course, the reference letters that I keep mentioning, we do have country-specific letters that certify employees have that essential employee status, and that helps provide access to the buildings that would otherwise be closed. So looking a little bit more closely at the workflow, you'll see in the middle here, there are two conditional approvals. Those are the ones that I mentioned where it's based on the country of the person submitting the request and whether or not we already have essential workers in that country. If we don't already have essential workers in that country, then we're routing that to our legal team so that they can review any local restrictions and regulations that might be in place, and they can work with our safety team to make sure that we're properly set up for essential workers in that location. And then once that is completed and the legal team provides us with a new letter for that country, then the process routes to HR administrator, which is basically the Workday on Workday team, and then we'll configure that letter and move it along the process. A couple of things to highlight here. The integration step that we have at the end of the process, it's a studio integration that completes two tasks for us. The first one is if the resolution is done, meaning the request is approved, then the requester is added to our custom organization, our COVID-19 Essential Employees custom organization. And the second thing that it does is the process will initiate a reference letter, a request reference letter for worker task. And so the reference letter is then generated and delivered to the employee's inbox. So from the requester standpoint, they only have to submit the request. They don't have to wait for an email or a phone call or some other notification that says that their request has been approved. Once their request is approved, the letter will automatically be generated for them and delivered to their inbox. And then they can download it and print it from there, or they can access it on their mobile phone. So in terms of benefits for us, we have the consistent approvals. So in the very early days of trying to come up with what the process was going to be, and everybody was, everything was a little unknown. Much of the interaction around or decisions around the essential worker status was maybe handled over email or other mediums, and documentation was kind of scattered. And so bringing it into the request framework allows us to apply a single approval path, and in all teams are using the same approval path and same process to make sure that essential employees are all granted with the same access as appropriate. And then the efficient process. So leveraging data that's already in HCM. So what country is this person in? What jobs are they in? All of that HCM data helps inform the process. And then also the cross-team integration between the legal team, the safety team, Workday on Workday, having that all included and routed through the same process was much more efficient than what we had been doing before. And then our power of one. So integrating the process end to end and auto-completing some of the steps that would have otherwise been done manually, so that integration at the end of the process, without that integration, we would have needed to notify somebody to go add the person to the custom organization. We would have needed to tell the employee to go request their reference letter. And so that integration at the end really provides a more seamless experience for the requesters. And one additional note that I'll make here, just kind of in the spirit of our power of one, we definitely at Workday tried to be very thoughtful and very intentional about how we were responding to the COVID pandemic and what types of solutions we were putting in place. Obviously, we wanted things to be able to solve our needs, but we were also thinking about our customers. So it wasn't just, does this work for us? Can this solve our problem? But will this also work for our customers? And we feel that with this particular use case and a few others that you may have seen us post on community already, we did really put our customers in mind. We really did have our customers in mind and what delivered solutions would be available to them and how we could weave those together to provide solutions that would help you all respond to the COVID pandemic. So hopefully that is some good information that you'd be able to use. And with that, I will hand it back over to Ashwin.
Thank you, Martha, for sharing that very timely use case. And thank you to all of our speakers who shared how the request framework transformed their business processes. I think one big takeaway from our presenters is the diversity in their use cases. It shows just how flexible and customizable the request framework is and how useful it can be across a variety of different functional areas. Like we had Martha's use case for the COVID-19 response, we saw just how quickly you can deploy a new request workflow. And with Deb and Lorena's presentations, our first two use cases, we really saw how the request framework helps bring in disparate processes into one system. With that, it looks like we have a few minutes to answer some questions. Let's see which one would be best to start with. Let's start with this one. I think this is a good one. There's a common theme here around auditing. To kind of paraphrase, the question seems to be, how does the auditing of these requests for changes work? How does the auditing of these requests for changes work? And specifically, how do you ensure completeness? How do you track all changes back to the request? Good question. So in the request framework, what you can do is associate a request to a Workday business object. And if you do that, you don't have to, but if you do, those requests will now create a audit trail entry on that object when you're viewing the audit trail for that object. So for example, if you have a request to change a business process definition, right? The workflow for a business process. You could associate the requests to change business process definition. You can associate those requests to the actual business process that you changed. And if you're viewing the audit trail for that business process, you can see that when and by whom a request was made against that object, and you can dig into that entry and see whether that request was marked as complete or not. And then subsequently, the very next entry should probably be the change that was actually made based on the request. So in that way, we create those line entries in the audit trails for the different objects that the requests are being made against, or requests are being made to modify. So that's one key way when you really want to get into the details of how objects were modified based on requests. Now, from a higher level point of view, you can build custom reports, much like Deb did from Williams. I saw a question on, does Williams use that custom report to, do they provide that to auditors when auditors are looking at what changes were made or what requests were made? And Deb confirmed that they do provide that report as the start, and then can dig into the different business objects or delivered audit reports if the auditor wants to dig in closer to a specific area. Next question we have is, can you explain how the questionnaire answers during the request process affected routing of subsequent steps in the process? That's a really good question. I think we saw both Williams and Florida Atlantic University using questionnaire answers to affect whether subsequent steps get routed or not. So how about we have Lorena from Florida Atlantic respond to this one. Lorena, are you comfortable taking this one?
Yes. So in
Awesome.
my presentation, there was one example which I went over about the cash manager. One of the participants filled out the questionnaire and answered that the check has already been cashed. So what that did was completely skip over all steps, and then went straight to close because there's nothing to be done. So that's one example. Another example is if the initiator filled out the form, the questionnaire, and answered that the return of funds related to Title IX, then that would make the process route to the financial aid department. And they would complete the approvals and the questionnaires and attach their own documents. So those are some examples of how we use the questionnaire answers. And that's embedded within the condition rules. And that's also, the way that we did that was creating several calculated fields to extract, for instance, not to get too technical, but, extracting single instance based on the condition that it was a certain question. And then, we format that, create a text, lowercase, uppercase, like that. And then that's what's included in our condition rule. So we would say, whatever that calculated field is, and then we would put contains, and then in that example for the cash manager, we have already cached. So we would enter that text. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Lorena. We have another few questions here. I think we have some time to answer. One of them is a question around security for the requests. Can you restrict the type of request that certain groups can submit? That's a really good question. So the request framework has very granular security that you can implement. So for each type, what we call a request type, so each of the use cases our presenters presented were an example of one request type. Now, in their organizations, they have many request types, and each of those request types can have their own security defined for who can initiate, who can view, and who can act on or correct data about that request. So with that, you have an extra layer of granular security control in addition to the typical business process security policy, which defines like the overall, for all request types, what are all the people that could possibly act on it. It's like a superset. And then for each request type, you can get granular and define the subset of people that can actually initiate and view those requests. We also have robust domain security for the request framework. So you can give people access, certain people access to report on requests, whereas others can actually initiate them. And then there's others that maybe a different subset that can actually view the details of the requests and comments made on them, for example. We have all those different levels of control. Another great question. Are there web services available to trigger requests? I like this one a lot. So a couple of releases ago, Workday delivered REST APIs for triggering, so initiating the request, viewing the request details, and closing the request. So we do have REST APIs that you can use to build custom entry points to trigger these requests within Workday, if you choose. There's a lot of robust documentation about that on our Workday Extend developer site. And then there's also documentation about that. Even if you're not a Workday Extend customer, there is documentation about the REST APIs on our community site, our public community site. If you type in, if you search up REST API documentation, it should come up, and all our REST APIs should be documented there. Let's see. I think we can take one more question. This one seems like a good one for you, Martha. The question is, can you explain more about how the integration works that you showed in your COVID-19 use case for automatically creating the reference letter for essential employees? Martha, are you comfortable taking that one?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. So I cannot take credit for actually building that integration myself, but what it's doing is essentially initiating an existing business process. So there's a business process out there that is called Request Reference Letter for Worker, I believe is what the name of it is. And so this Studio integration is essentially taking the worker who submitted the request and initiating that business process task for that worker. And then because we have the reference letters configured ahead of time and they're by country, we can deliver the correct letter to the worker based on what country they're in.
Awesome. Great feedback. Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Lorena. So I think that's a wrap. I think there are a few questions that we didn't get to, but they are very specific questions that we can follow up with through email to the individual askers. And with that, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who attended today's presentation. And that wraps up today's Looking Forward with Workday webinar. So thank you, everyone.